Chapter 1. A picture-perfect whodunit was the sort of afternoon that one hoped for, an early September warm, but not stifling, with a breeze that carried the faint scent of honeysuckle and wood smoke across the gardens of Nether Ridley. The village basked in that post-summer glow, half tucked into autumn's embrace, but still clinging to the gentle pleasures of sun-dappled hedgerows and late-blooming roses. At the heart of this genteel tranquility stood the vicarage, with its neatly trimmed boxwood borders and its flagstone path that led invitingly to a wrought iron gate. And it was there, on the vicarage lawn beneath a striped canvas awning, that Miss Lavinia Chetwynd hosted her annual art appreciation tea. The event had grown over the years from a modest affair into something of a village tradition. Aspiring painters displayed their latest efforts, jam tarts were judged with the same scrutiny as brushwork, and villagers exchanged gossip with the relaxed freedom granted by finger sandwiches and cream cakes. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a trailing clematis vine at a side table, appeared entirely at ease. Dressed in dove gray, with a sprig of lavender pinned to her lapel, she sipped her tea and nodded politely as a young woman in a wide-brimmed straw hat explained the importance of brushstroke direction in impressionist work. But Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, while seemingly absorbed in the art of polite listening, were engaged in a silent survey of her surroundings. There was Lavinia Chetwynd herself, always bustling, always eager to please, flitting from guest to guest with a painted-on smile and an occasional sideways glance toward her star exhibit, a portrait recently completed by the well-regarded but somewhat moody artist Julian Harmon. The portrait stood on an easel in the center of the lawn, shielded from the sun by a parasol. It was a striking likeness of Lavinia's late brother, Colonel Augustus Chetwynd, depicted in full military dress with a look of noble contemplation. The portrait had only been unveiled the week before and had, according to Lavinia, already been much admired by all who had seen it. But today there was a new element of excitement, an edge to the usual clinking of teacups and murmurs of praise, because though no one had yet said so aloud, something about the portrait seemed altered. "I dare say it's the light, Miss Weatherby," the retired schoolmistress was heard saying to Mrs. Penrith as the two studied the painting with squinted eyes. "Makes shadows behave strangely. But I could have sworn no, it's probably just my imagination." Miss Marple, who overheard this remark quite clearly, allowed herself a thoughtful sip of tea. She'd thought the same thing herself. The sense of vague disquiet hovered like a gnat on the edge of every conversation. The Colonel's expression, stern and composed at the original unveiling, now seemed somehow to convey a wry smirk, as though he were holding in a private joke. Some even whispered that the color of his eyes had darkened, though of course that was nonsense, wasn't it? Julian Harmon had not been seen that day, though his presence had been expected. Miss Chetwynd made an effort to explain this to those who inquired. Julian had an unfortunate migraine this morning. He sent word he'd try to come later. "But you know how sensitive artistic temperaments can be," she told Reverend Greaves with a breezy laugh. But Miss Marple, watching from her seat, noted the slight tension in Lavinia's fingers as she smoothed her napkin twice. The oddity with the portrait was the main subject of murmured conversation by the time scones were served. "I don't want to sound fanciful," said Mrs. Frobisher, the butcher's wife, her voice lowered over a fruit tart, "but I could swear the angle of his collar's different. It's too high on one side." "Well, Colonel Chetwynd had a very stiff upper lip, if you take my meaning," muttered her neighbor, Mr. Mowbray, with a chuckle that faltered in the silence that followed. Miss Marple, for her part, made no remark on the painting. Instead, she observed reactions whose gaze lingered too long on the portrait, who avoided it altogether, and who, like young Elsie Brentwood, the vicar's niece, turned positively pale when her eyes met the Colonel's. Later, as the crowd thinned and guests filtered away with leftover scones wrapped in napkins, Miss Marple approached the easel. The light had shifted by then afternoon gold to evening amber, and shadows played across the canvas to a casual eye. The painting still held its regal composition. But there was indeed something altered, however imperceptible. The brushwork was the same. The signature in the corner, J. Harmon, July, unchanged. But the emotion conveyed in the Colonel's eyes was not what it had been. Miss Marple examined the frame closely. No sign of tampering, no misplaced fibers or shifted mountings. Yet she could not shake the sensation that something had been done to it. "Ah, Miss Marple," came Lavinia's voice from behind her, a note too bright in its cheer. "A splendid gathering, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed, Lavinia," Miss Marple said with a pleasant smile. "Such a lovely portrait. One sees something new in it every time one looks." Miss Chetwynd gave a strained chuckle. "Yes, Julian is quite gifted, quite intuitive." Her eyes darted toward the easel. He captured Augustus so perfectly, so vividly. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Vivid, yes. Though I must say there's something almost mischievous in the expression now. Have you noticed?" Lavinia's lips thinned. "Perhaps it's the lighting. The day's changing. That must be it." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes lingered on Lavinia just a moment longer than necessary. That night, the talk of the portrait continued in hushed tones over suppers and under lamplight. Some declared it nonsense. Others were less certain. But the next morning, all idle speculation turned to horror. Julian Harmon was found dead in his cottage, just beyond the village green, slumped over his easel. A broken bottle of turpentine beside him, and the unmistakable smell of almond in the air. Miss Marple, reading the news in a note delivered by the vicar's maid, folded her hands carefully in her lap. "A tragic accident," the note concluded, though the words felt curiously hollow. Miss Marple gazed out her sitting room window, where the sun cast its glow across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. "Or not an accident at all," she murmured. Chapter 2. Whispers beneath the ivy. The morning after the portrait's mysterious transformation dawned damp and gray. A mist rolled down from the hills behind Stonygate's house and settled over the lawns, like a shawl forgotten on a chair. The village of Heatherly Cross stirred slowly under a veil of drizzle, with chimney smoke curling listlessly into the dull sky. At the breakfast table in Stonygate's long, oak-paneled dining room, conversation was muted. Geraldine Ashcombe sat stiffly beside her husband Hugh, her toast untouched, while young Simon Davnish, Geraldine's nephew by marriage, kept glancing up at the painting on the far wall. Even in the weak morning light, the portrait of Lady Cecilia Ashcombe looked somehow wrong. Her once serene smile seemed colder now, her painted eyes sharp, almost judgmental. Or perhaps it was the suggestion, planted like a seed the night before, that had begun to grow in their minds. Miss Marple, seated with her usual quiet grace at the far end of the table, sipped her tea and observed. No one had mentioned the painting yet, and she had learned long ago that people often revealed the most in their efforts not to speak of a thing. "It's very strange weather for July," Hugh muttered at last, buttering a piece of toast with more force than necessary. "You'd think it was March." "Strange weather for strange happenings," Simon offered, with an uneasy half-laugh. Geraldine's knuckles whitened around her cup. "Honestly, I wish people would stop whispering about that silly painting. Paintings don't change, for heaven's sake, but it has changed, hasn't it?" Simon pressed gently. Even Mr. Reeves, who surely wouldn't notice if someone painted a giraffe on the ceiling, commented on it. "I don't think it's silly at all," said a soft voice. Lydia Browning, the gardener's daughter, and now the estate's social secretary, had entered quietly. Her hands were still faintly smudged with soil. "I saw the portrait yesterday morning when I came to dust in here." The face was warmer. It was different, Geraldine bristled. "Well, perhaps you were simply in a warmer mood yesterday." Lydia flushed and looked away. "Perhaps. Miss Marple set her teacup down with delicate precision. You know, I once knew a lady in Much Benham who claimed her dog spoke Latin. She said mildly that there was a pause as everyone turned to look at her. She was quite certain of it. The poor creature would bark twice when she said salve, and 3 times for veil. Most intriguing. Of course, it later transpired that the dear woman had been slightly touched in the head, and the dog was merely barking because she had taken to keeping sausages in her pocket. There was a ripple of polite laughter, though Miss Marple's eyes missed nothing. Lydia glanced gratefully at her. Simon's expression darkened. After breakfast, the household dispersed. Geraldine retreated to the morning room with her embroidery. Hugh disappeared into the study under the pretext of sorting estate papers, and Simon and Lydia took shelter from the drizzle beneath the ivy-clad arch leading to the garden. Miss Marple, ostensibly absorbed in a volume of Ruskin she had brought with her, remained seated in the drawing room, occasionally glancing up at the portrait. The eyes had changed. She was certain of it. But the question, as always, was not how there were many means to manipulate paint and light, but why. Outside, under the ivy, Simon lit a cigarette and stared out at the mist-drenched lawns. Lydia stood beside him, her arms folded tightly. "She's furious, you know," he said. "Geraldine. That we even looked at the painting last night. I don't understand her," Lydia murmured. "Why does she care so much? It's just a painting." Simon gave a mirthless chuckle. To her, it's not just a painting, it's a shrine. Her way of keeping control of the family legacy. Lady Cecilia is a symbol one she's made into something almost sacred. Lydia hesitated. Then changing it would be a threat. He looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Lydia bit her lip. "If someone did change it, if the portrait really was altered, it might be more than a prank. It could be a message or a warning." Simon let out a low whistle. "You sound like Miss Marple. Maybe that's not such a bad thing." As they spoke, a faint figure passed behind the hedgerow near the far rose garden stoop, cloaked and moving with slow, deliberate steps. Neither Simon nor Lydia noticed. Later that day, the piece of the estate was shattered. It was the maid, Jenny, who found the body in the conservatory, a place no one had much cause to visit during such damp weather. Miss Marple, summoned by the household's shrieks, arrived to find the staff gathered at a cautious distance, and Hugh pale-faced at the door. Inside, among shattered flower pots and the musky scent of damp earth, lay the crumpled figure of Mr. Reeves, the estate's long-serving manservant. His spectacles had slipped askew, and a trail of dried blood marked the edge of the glass bench where his head had struck. The scene might have been an accident, but the broken handle of a brass watering can lay suspiciously close to the body. Inspector Crayford was called from the nearby town of Little Daring. A practical man with a fondness for straightforward motives and confessions, he surveyed the scene with tight lips and furrowed brow. "Poor devil," he muttered. "Fell and cracked his skull, or someone helped him along. No sign of robbery. Nothing obviously disturbed. He'd have no reason to be in the conservatory today," Lydia said, shaken. "He always said the humidity made his joints ache." Inspector Crayford looked over at Miss Marple, who had quietly knelt beside the body, examining the position of the fallen spectacles. "What do you make of it, madam?" he asked. "Oh, I shouldn't presume," she replied sweetly. "But I do find it curious, don't you, Inspector, that the watering can is broken in such a way that suggests it was swung, not dropped?" Crayford frowned. "Are you suggesting murder, Miss Marple?" "I suggest nothing," she said calmly. "Only that it would be unwise to dismiss the scene as a simple fall, especially when one considers what Mr. Reeves may have seen, or perhaps what he was about to say." She rose to her feet and glanced back toward the house, where the portrait of Lady Cecilia now hung behind closed doors. The expression on the painting remained frozen, half serene, half knowing. Chapter 3 of Sketches and Suspicions, the following. Morning dawned with a sullen sky stretched gray and heavy over stony gates. A damp mist lingered over the rooftops and settled into the hedgerows like a tired guest reluctant to leave. Yet, in spite of the gloom, the village stirred with uncommon energy. The news of the odd incident at Windrush House, particularly the mysterious alteration of the Colonel's portrait, had trickled into the lanes and cottages, carried on the hushed gossip of early risers and milk rounds. At the Bluebell Tea Room, Mrs. Edgecombe declared confidently to anyone who would listen that the ghost of Colonel Stanhope himself had returned, unsettled in death, just as he was in life. This, of course, was met with vigorous nods and cross murmurs from the other patrons, all too happy to add their own flourishes to the tale. But at the vicarage, the tone was far less theatrical. Reverend Montague, who had been present the evening before, sipped his morning tea in distracted silence while his wife, Eleanor, rattled the crockery more noisily than necessary. "I must say, Monty, I don't like it," she said at last, her voice low but firm. "That girl Clara looked pale as milk when she saw that portrait. You saw her, didn't you?" The vicar nodded. "Yes, indeed. Quite pale. But then again, it was a rather strange shock, wasn't it? Perhaps merely an overactive imagination. She's very young. Or perhaps someone intended for her to react that way," Eleanor said sharply. "The whole thing is unnatural. Who paints a portrait one day and wakes to find it changed the next?" Reverend Montague sighed. "Someone with access to oil. Paints in a curious motive, perhaps." That same morning, Miss Marple was seated by her parlor window, knitting a navy blue scarf for her great-nephew David. Her needles clicked gently, but her mind wandered far from the stitch count. She had received a note from Mrs. Faulkner, hand-delivered by young Peter Watts, the butcher's son, inviting her for tea that afternoon. A discreet appeal, delicately phrased. "I would be so comforted by your company this afternoon, dear Miss Marple. There is something rather troubling on my mind." Miss Marple's eyes, pale and shrewd beneath a lace-trimmed hat, narrowed slightly. There was no doubt in her mind that the request was linked to the strange goings-on at Windrush House. And indeed, the timing was curious. That Clara should see a different face on the portrait, one that startled her into a near-faint raised all manner of questions. A portrait, Miss Marple reflected, was more than just paint and canvas. It was a reflection of self, or at the very least, how others perceived one. To have it altered deliberately, subtly enough to be unnerving, but not overtly so pointed to motive. And in her long experience, motive was never without direction. At Windrush House, Mrs. Faulkner was seated at her writing desk when Clara entered the drawing room. The girl looked pale still, though she had composed herself since the prior evening. "You sent for me, Aunt?" Mrs. Faulkner looked up, surprised by the formality. Clara rarely used that tone. "Yes, my dear. I wondered if you'd be willing to describe precisely what you saw in the portrait last night." Clara fidgeted. "It sounds mad, I know. But..." The face Colonel Stanhope's, it looked altered. The expression had changed. His mouth was thinner. The eyes were narrower. And something about the chin, it was crueler. "And you're quite certain it wasn't merely a trick of them light?" Mrs. Faulkner pressed gently. "No," Clara said. "It was as if the whole energy of the man had changed. I can't explain it better than that." Double quotes, Mrs. Faulkner exhaled slowly. "I don't think you're mad, Clara, but I do think someone has tampered with the portrait. And I have the oddest feeling it wasn't meant for you to notice. You simply got there first." Clara looked up, startled. "But who would do such a thing? And why?" Mrs. Faulkner hesitated. "That is what I hope Miss Marple can help us uncover." Later that day, as promised, Miss Marple arrived at Windrush House. She was shown into the morning room, where the portrait in question hung above the fireplace. Clara stood beside it, arms crossed, her expression guarded. Miss Marple stepped forward, peering up at the canvas through her spectacles. She said nothing for a moment, only tilted her head slightly to one side, then the other. "It's a fine work," she murmured at last, although ... not quite as fine as it might first appear. The brushstrokes near the lower jaw seemed somewhat hurried. And the shading around the eyes, yes, someone has added to this. You mean it was altered? Clara asked eagerly. Miss Marple nodded. I should say so. Whoever did it had a steady hand and knew just how far they could go without rendering. It absurd. A skilled amateur, perhaps. Mrs. Faulkner, standing behind them, folded her hands. But what could possibly be the motive? That, said Miss Marple softly, is what we must determine. But I dare say we should begin not by examining the portrait, but the painter. Mr. Quentin Ames? Clara asked. He's hardly the sort to commit mischief. A bit ... dramatic, perhaps. But quite devoted to his work. Miss Marple nodded. All the more reason to speak with him, then. Artists, my dear Clara, are far more revealing with their silences than with their words. Quentin Ames lived in a modest thatched cottage on the southern edge of the village. A painter of respectable talent and equal eccentricity, he had been recently welcomed into local circles following a favorable review in Country Homes and Art Monthly. When Miss Marple and Clara called upon him that afternoon, they were received into a cluttered studio filled with unfinished canvases and the unmistakable scent of linseed oil. My dear Miss Marple, and Miss Clara, what an unexpected pleasure, he said, brushing a smudge of red paint from his cheek. I hope we're not interrupting, Miss Marple said mildly, though her eyes swept the studio with quiet precision. Not at all, not at all. Just working on a new series, landscapes this time. A change of pace from all the dreary faces. Although your grandfather's portrait was hardly dreary, dear girl. A strong jaw. A noble posture. Clara smiled faintly. That's what I thought until last night. Ames blinked. Yes, ... I heard something of that. Mrs. Faulkner telephoned this morning. I must say, I can't imagine how such a notion came to be. Tampering with a portrait. Why, the very idea. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet, Mr. Ames, you did have the painting here in your studio for several weeks before returning it to Windrush House. Indeed, of course. But I assure you, I delivered it just as I left it. Clara's brow furrowed. Did anyone else have access to the studio during that time? Ames hesitated. Well, only my assistant Leo, young lad. Talented in his own way, but rather careless. I dare say he might have knocked over a brush or two, but he wouldn't have touched a commissioned portrait. Miss Marple's knitting bag shifted as she clasped her hands gently over it. Even so, Mr. Ames, I wonder if Leo might be worth speaking with. Sometimes it's those closest to a thing who notice what others miss. Ames nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. As you wish, Miss Marple, but I doubt he'll be of any help. Doubt, Miss Marple said softly, has a curious way of becoming certainty when one listens closely enough. As they left the studio, Clara glanced sideways at Miss Marple. Do you think Mr. Ames was lying? Not lying, said Miss Marple, but perhaps omitting. And that is often the more dangerous of the two. They walked on in silence, the village quiet but watchful, as if holding its breath. Whatever had begun with a portrait's subtle transformation now had threads stretching into hidden corners of stony gates, and Miss Marple, as always, was gently tugging at them. Chapter 4. The Whispering Walls of Elston Grange. Morning light filtered faintly through the thick veil of mist that blanketed Elston Grange, the great house shrouded in a heavy hush. Fog drifted through the surrounding yews and hazels like the trailing hem of a ghost's gown, and the distant toll of a church bell, muffled and hesitant, seemed to mark the beginning of a day no one wished to face. Inside the manor, the halls felt cloistered and withdrawn, every sound dampened by the gloom. Tapestries clung to the walls like sullen spectators, and the carved mahogany furniture seemed somehow darker in this filtered morning light. Miss Marple, though a guest in the grand house, did not sleep well. The events of the night, the scream, The inexplicable alteration in the portrait, and the strange atmosphere at dinner looped through her mind in a quiet procession of images. She had risen early, watched the mist gather thick outside her window, and dressed with quiet deliberation, pinning a modest gold brooch to her cardigan and smoothing the pleats of her skirt with care. The dining room retained none of the liveliness it had held during the previous evening's gathering. Only 3 guests had appeared so far. Major Percival Dunbar, seated rigidly with a newspaper open but unread before him. Lydia Crossfield, her normally animated expression drawn with fatigue, and Mrs. Rilland was nowhere to be seen. The air was hushed, the scraping of cutlery and the faint clink of porcelain plates unusually prominent. Did anyone hear him leave? Lydia's voice broke the silence, pitched low with apprehension. She stirred her tea but seemed too distracted to drink. Edwin Markham. He's not in his room. The bed wasn't even slept in. Major Dunbar grunted without lifting his eyes. Could have slipped out before dawn. Men like him often do when they've said something foolish or too much. Miss Marple took a modest sip of her tea before placing her cup back on its saucer. I'm not certain Mr. Markham struck me as the sort to flee from embarrassment. If anything, I found him bold, determined to be heard, even if not invited to speak. Lydia glanced toward the door, voice hushed. But that portrait, everyone saw it. You don't just imagine something like that. Her expression, it was different, cold, almost accusing. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Yes, it was different. And more than just the face. Did you notice the bracelet? Lydia blinked. Bracelet? In the altered version of the portrait. The girl Charlotte, wasn't it? Now wears a bracelet on her wrist. Garnets, I believe. Not present in the original. Lydia pressed her napkin to her lips. But how could anyone have changed it so perfectly? It looked old, part of the original, not like it was repainted. Just then, Alicia Rilland entered the room briskly, her cheeks slightly flushed and her posture stiffer than usual. Her brown tweed jacket was still dusted with a few fine flecks of rain from the garden. She paused at the threshold, her eyes moving across the quiet tableau before her. Edwin's room hasn't been used, she said in a low, tight voice. Perkins says no one saw him return to his room after dinner. And one of the gardeners thought he saw a figure moving toward the orchard path just after midnight. That settles it, muttered Major Dunbar. He ran, took one look at that blasted painting, realized he'd said too much, and slunk off like a cur. No, Major, Alicia said firmly. He's still on the grounds, or was. His shoes are still by the door. The heavy ones he wore for walking. A silence followed, heavy and uncertain. By late morning, Inspector Cray arrived from Melchester in a mud-spattered motor car, accompanied by a stony-faced constable. Cray was a thin man with sparse straw-colored hair and a nose like a hawk's beak, eyes narrowed perpetually as if he mistrusted the very air. He listened to the guests' accounts with polite impatience, nodding through the mention of the scream, the changed portrait, and Mr. Markham's disappearance with equal skepticism. Too much imagination in country houses, he murmured to his constable. Fog, creaking floors, and nervous ladies make ghosts out of shadows. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the hearth, said nothing, but her eyes followed every gesture, every twitch of Cray's lip and furrow of brow. It was not incompetence she sensed in him, but a certain lack of imagination. And in cases such as these, that was almost as dangerous. By noon, a small search party was organized, combing the orchard, the greenhouse, and the path that wound through the sunken garden and down to the old well, a relic from the Tudor foundations of the estate. Alicia, concerned for her guest, insisted on joining the search herself, leaving Miss Marple behind at the house under the pretense of rest. But rest was not her intention. As soon as the household had quieted, Miss Marple asked Perkins if she might sit in the morning room for some light knitting. The butler, a man of habitual discretion, offered no objection. Once alone, she set her knitting gently in her lap and rose to her feet. With care, she made her way through the corridor, toward the portrait gallery. The doors had been cordoned off with a simple rope and a printed note. Under police. Investigation. Do not enter. But Miss Marple was not one to be easily deterred by rope or notice. She slipped beneath the barrier and approached the painting. The girl in the portrait, Charlotte, was still there, of course, but her painted presence now seemed to shimmer with something far more chilling than before. Her once wistful eyes had turned severe, her mouth subtly hardened. The bracelet gleamed faintly at her wrist. Miss Marple leaned in close. The brushwork was meticulous, but the varnish atop the canvas bore the faintest signs of recent tampering. An area no larger than a coin showed a shimmer that did not match the original gloss. Carefully, she took a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at the edge. Nothing came away, but the scent very faint, but there was unmistakable. Turpentine. Fresh. Paint, she thought. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the hall. Miss Marple slipped back through the cordon just as Alicia returned, her face pale and drawn. "They found him," she said. Her voice trembled slightly. Miss Marple met her eyes. "Where?" "In the orchard, at the base of the old well. He's dead, Jane." The older woman stood very still. "Was it an accident?" Alicia shook her head. "He'd been struck. There was a mark on his temple, and they found something in his coat." From her pocket, Alicia produced a folded slip of yellowing paper. Miss Marple unfolded it with care. It was a torn diary page, the edges brittle with age. A single name had been scrawled hastily in the center, faded but legible. "Charlotte Ainsley." Miss Marple exhaled softly. "So it is her. You know the name?" Alicia whispered. "I recall reading about her years ago. A governess. She disappeared mysteriously in the 1880s. There was a small feature about the case in the lady, if I remember correctly. She was last known to be working for a family in Sussex, a quiet, educated girl. No one ever found out what happened to her." Alicia stared. "You think the portrait is of her?" "I do," said Miss Marple. "And I think Mr. Markham discovered that as well, likely during his work with the archives. Perhaps he stumbled upon something that linked her to the family, something someone had taken great care to forget." The sound of rain had begun to tap gently against the windows, and the mist outside thickened again, swallowing the orchard and all it concealed. Miss Marple stepped to the window and stared out across the overgrown garden. "You see, Alicia, memory has a strange way of living in houses, especially old ones. They trap more than just dust in the corners. Sometimes they trap guilt, or shame, or whispers." Alicia joined her, her voice barely above a breath. "You think someone killed him to keep that name buried? I believe someone may be willing to kill again," Miss Marple replied. "And we must be exceedingly careful not to let them know how close we are to uncovering it." Chapter 5. Rumors in Oil and Turpentine. By mid-morning the following day, the village of Ellerby Green was thick with speculation. The events at the Rothley residence, an altered portrait, a frantic companion, and the sudden arrival of the police had stirred something elemental in the villagers, their talent for speculation. The vicar's wife claimed it was witchcraft. Mr. Porteous, the retired banker, swore it was forgery. And Miss Marple, taking her tea in the garden of the Whodunits, merely stirred her spoon in thoughtful silence. "She's not been herself since her return from Paris," murmured Miss Hartwell, the town's most diligent church volunteer, as she passed the bakery. "Did you see how pale she looked when she stepped outside yesterday? And that awful shriek? She said the painting changed. You'd think she'd seen a ghost," replied Mrs. Finch, the butcher's wife. "Perhaps it's guilt. That sort of money never comes without a price." They were not alone in their conjectures. Across Ellerby Green, the mystery had threaded itself into every conversation. but none spoke as little or observed as much as Miss Marple. That morning, she'd received a modest parcel by post containing a faded art magazine from 2 years ago, one she'd requested quietly from her niece in London. After carefully turning to an article on rising portraitists of Europe, she marked a name with a pencil: Paul Vernis. Paris. Just then, a soft knock came at her back garden gate. Mary Hillard, red-faced and clearly out of breath, stood there, clutching her handbag. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding," she said, voice quivering slightly. I didn't know who else to speak to." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, gesturing to the garden chair across from her. "You look like you could do with a cup of tea." Mary sank into the seat and clutched the china cup offered to her. She did not sip it at once, but instead looked off into the garden, where bees hovered lazily over the lavender. "It's about the painting," Mary began, lowering her voice, though no one was around to overhear. "The one in Lady Rothley's sitting room. I swear to you, Miss Marple, it has changed." "I believe you," said Miss Marple gently, setting down her own cup. "Though I suspect it's not the painting that changed, so much as what it reveals." Mary looked startled. "You mean someone replaced it?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice calm. "Or perhaps what was always there has become newly visible. You see, memory can be a curious thing, especially when grief clouds the mind." Mary hesitated, twisting a lace handkerchief in her lap. "There's something I didn't tell the inspector." Miss Marple folded her hands. "You may speak freely with me, Mary. It's Lady Rothley's habits." Before she left for Paris, she would often sit in that very room, staring at the portrait. Sometimes for hours, she was obsessed with it. But when she returned, she would barely look at it until yesterday. "And when she did, she screamed," Mary whispered, as though something in it had betrayed her. She kept muttering. "About the eyes, said they'd never looked like that before." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "Eyes can reveal much. Or conceal." Mary leaned closer. "I thought at first she was imagining things, but now—" "Miss Marple, last night, I crept back into the drawing room after she'd gone to bed. I stood in front of that portrait and looked at it for 10 minutes. And I noticed something I hadn't before. Yes, there's a scratch just above the left eye, like someone took a blade to the canvas. It wasn't there before. I would have noticed. I dust it every week." "Curious," murmured Miss Marple. "And this painting, it was commissioned?" "Yes, a Parisian artist. Lord Rothley met him abroad. The portrait was completed last year, just before Lord Rothley passed away. He adored it. Said it captured her perfectly. But now it shows her in a different light." Mary nodded slowly. "Cold, accusing. And she's wearing a necklace in the painting emeralds. But Lady Rothley never owned such a piece." "Not that I've ever seen." Miss Marple's eyes glittered. "You're quite certain?" "I've helped pack her jewelry for years. There's pearls, yes. A sapphire brooch. But nothing emerald." Miss Marple's voice was almost inaudible. "An emerald necklace appearing in a painted likeness, worn by a woman who doesn't possess one. A scratch above the eye, and eyes that seemed to accuse." She rose gently from her chair, motioning Mary to follow. "Would you mind taking a short walk with me? I feel a visit to the local framer may be in order." The Ellerby Framing and Restoration Workshop was a modest space at the edge of the green, run by a meticulous man named Mr. Vernon Blake. The scent of linseed oil and turpentine clung to the walls, and half-finished frames stood like skeletal ruins along one corner. "Miss Marple," he greeted, adjusting his spectacles. "Always a pleasure. And to you, Mr. Blake, I wonder if I might ask you about canvas techniques." Blake's eyebrows lifted. "Certainly," Miss Marple gestured at a stack of canvases. "If one wished to alter a portrait subtly, mind. Would it be possible to repaint a detail without removing the original?" "Ah," Blake said, warming to the topic. Yes, if done skillfully, especially with oils. You could paint over sections, alter expressions, even change small features. The original would remain underneath unless the paint was stripped. And if someone wanted to reveal what had been painted over, they'd need to carefully remove the top layer. It's a delicate process. Or, if the top paint had started to crack or scratch, it might show through naturally, especially if the materials weren't properly sealed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And is it common to elements like jewelry that weren't present in real life? Blake chuckled. Artists have been flattering their subjects for centuries. A necklace, a fuller figure, a softened gaze, it all depends on the patron's desire. Back outside, Mary whispered, "Do you think the necklace was added later?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Her gaze lingered on the church tower in the distance. "I think someone wanted to be remembered a certain way, or perhaps wanted someone else to remember them differently." They walked on in silence, their footsteps soft on the gravel path. That afternoon, Lady Rothley was nowhere to be seen. According to the housemaid, she'd taken to her room with a splitting headache. The doctor had visited but said she needed only rest. Mary's face was drawn with concern. "I don't like how she's behaving. So jumpy, she barely eats. And she keeps locking the drawing room." Miss Marple gave her a quiet look. "She's afraid, dear. Because something she thought was buried, some secret, has resurfaced. Just like an image beneath a coat of paint." "And you think it has to do with the portrait?" Miss Marple looked up at the sky, which had begun to darken with the promise of a summer storm. "I think the painting is not merely a likeness, but a message. And someone, perhaps the artist, or perhaps the person who altered it, wants it to be seen." Mary's voice dropped. "You think it's a warning?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, or a confession. Time, as with art, reveals more than we intend. And as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, Miss Marple knew that the secrets locked within the painted eyes were only just beginning to speak. Chapter 6. The garden beneath the canvas, the morning after Inspector Crayford's rather lukewarm interrogation of the guests at Heathercombe House dawned bright and clear. The sun rose with determined cheeriness over the rooftops of St. Mildred's Vale, as though the unsettling events of the last 2 days could be dismissed like a faint dream. But there was something uneasy about the way the sparrows flitted from bush to branch, and the way the gardeners at the manor avoided looking up at the gallery wing. Miss Marple, breakfasting late at the vicarage with a generous pot of marmalade and toast at her side, stirred her tea thoughtfully. She had not been sleeping well. The matter of the portrait, the altered eyes, the missing brushwork, and now, the theft of Lady Helen's ruby pendant, presented an odd puzzle, and odd puzzles, Miss Marple knew from long experience, were rarely unrelated. Reverend Mayhew had not taken the news well that morning. He was distressed, naturally, by the theft, but more so by the implications. Someone he had hosted, someone from their close-knit village, had committed the act. The notion struck at the very core of what the vicar believed about his community. "I cannot help but feel personally responsible, Miss Marple," he had confessed as he poured her second cup of tea. "I opened the gallery myself. I welcomed them all." "And you would do so again," Miss Marple had replied gently. "We must never let a single act of wickedness soil an entire season of kindness, Reverend." Still, it was not the pendant that tugged at her mind the most. No, it was that portrait. She tucked her shawl around her shoulders and decided on a slow stroll to the manor. There were no formal events today. Inspector Crayford, as she understood, had taken the train to nearby Darnley to consult with county headquarters, which Miss Marple translated as cooling his heels while the clues settled. In his absence, the villagers were abuzz, and not just with gossip. One of the garden staff, young Matthew Pritchard, had reportedly found something peculiar near the compost heap behind the gallery. Miss Marple arrived at Heathercombe under the pretense of returning a misplaced glove. It was, in truth, hers, and not misplaced, but she found herself met at the side gate by Mrs. Withers, the housekeeper. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Withers said, brushing her apron. "They found something, Mr. Pritchard, the gardener's boy. You ought to come." Miss Marple followed her through the kitchen gardens, her eyes sharp despite her gentle gait. She passed low beds of sweet peas, rows of rhubarb, and the delicate, trembling heads of hydrangeas, all exquisite. And just beyond them, two men bent over something near a dense rose bush. Matthew Pritchard, barely 20 and with a mop of straw-colored hair, looked up nervously. "Miss Marple," he mumbled, standing aside to let her see. Nestled in the grass was a velvet cloth, stained and crumpled, with a broken clasp hanging by a single thread of gold. It was unmistakably Lady Helen's pendant pouch. "Found it just now, ma'am," Matthew said. "Was weeding by the roses, and there it was. But look, the clasp is broken like it was torn off." Miss Marple knelt beside it, careful not to disturb anything. She examined the cloth then, glanced at the bush. The edges of the rose stems were broken, and one of the blooms looked recently crushed. "Someone passed through here in a hurry," she murmured. She turned to Matthew. "Was this area visible from the gallery window?" Matthew scratched his head. "Not really. The compost heap's right round the bend there. Could have easily snuck past. And this cloth, wet on one side," she added. "It rained lightly after midnight, but not before. Which means whoever dropped it did so early this morning," Mrs. Withers finished, nodding. "Before sunrise, most likely." Miss Marple stood, brushing her skirt. "Indeed, and that tells us quite a bit." By mid-afternoon, the house was quieter, with most of the guests either retired to their rooms or lingering in the conservatory. Miss Marple requested a short meeting with Lady Helen, who seemed reluctant but ultimately obliged, leading her to the drawing room, a dignified chamber lined with faded tapestries and family crests. Lady Helen, composed and regal even under strain, wore a dark blue dress and no jewelry. Her eyes were tired. "You wish to see me, Miss Marple?" "Yes, dear Lady Helen, and I shan't take up much of your time. It's about the pendant. The cloth was found, and I dare say that rest may soon follow, but I had a thought. A memory, really." "Oh?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You see, I recall a case in Nether Wallop, many years ago, where a gentleman insisted something had been stolen from his safe. As it turned out, he had hidden it himself, afraid of being accused of losing a family heirloom. In the end, his maid found it behind the radiator." Lady Helen's eyes narrowed. "You are suggesting I hid the pendant?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "Only that sometimes people hide things, or alter things, to test the loyalty of others, or to see who might react oddly." A long silence followed. Finally, Lady Helen replied, "That would be quite a cruel game to play." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but it would explain a few things. Why only the pendant was taken, why the portrait was tampered with, and why, oddly enough, only one set of fingerprints was on the gallery window latch, yours." Lady Helen's expression did not change, but her hands, which had rested calmly in her lap, now clasped one another tightly. Before she could speak, the door opened, and in strode Colonel Everly, flushed from the sun. "Helen, I was just— Oh, Miss Marple." "Pardon me," Miss Marple smiled. "No pardon needed. I was just leaving." Outside the drawing room, she met with young Matthew once more. "Did you bring what I asked?" He nodded, handing over a folded linen napkin. Inside was a scrap of canvas, barely more than a strip, with smudged paint on it. Miss Marple turned it gently in her fingers. "Behind the gallery, you said?" "Yes, tucked under the drainpipe near the window." "Then I think," she murmured, "the painting was altered after the pendant was taken, not before." She looked up toward the gallery's east-facing window, where the once haunting portrait still stood in its ornate frame. From this angle, the eyes could not be seen, But Miss Marple felt their presence all the same, watching, accusing, waiting, and someone, she was sure now, had wanted the eyes to tell a different story. Chapter 7. The Glint Behind the Curtain. Morning after the unexpected scene at the vicarage hall where the whisper of Mrs. Delphine, Blount's old Paris affair had spread like spilled St. Chad's was unusually quiet. Suspicion like a chill had crept through the hedgerows and tea tables of the village. Doors were shut a little tighter. Curtains moved when no breeze stirred. People had begun to eye one another with a blend of curiosity and unease. At Hillside Cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly embroidering a pale wisteria motif onto a linen cushion cover. Her needle moved with unhurried precision. Only the occasional twitch of her brow betrayed her attention was not truly on the thread. "I always say," she murmured aloud, though no one was in the room with her, "a village is like a painting. It's not just what's in the frame, it's what the artist chose to leave out that tells you the truth." She stood, smoothing her skirt, and looked once more at the photograph of the painting taken by young Timothy Payne, which he had left with her. It was from the night of the unveiling, showing Lady Clara in full regalia, but notably missing the oddity that had emerged the following morning. In this photograph, Lady Clara's portrait smiled with graceful detachment. There was no indication of the now famous alteration, the hand upon the pearl necklace. Miss Marple peered at it through her reading glasses. No hand there," she said to herself. "Not yet." She made her way to the post office, ostensibly to send a letter to her nephew Raymond, but really to observe. Along the way, she passed Mrs. Merriweather, who was standing at her garden gate with a suspiciously damp handkerchief and eyes swollen with emotion. "Terrible, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Merriweather said before being prompted. "What with everything going on." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Though, one can hardly be surprised. Affairs of the heart have a way of surfacing, however deep one buries them." Mrs. Merriweather stiffened slightly, blinking. "Lady Clara must be dreadfully embarrassed," Miss Marple added delicately. "Having one's past turned into, well, artwork is not something a woman of her standing would take lightly." Mrs. Merriweather nodded quickly. "They say the Baron Delphine's Paris gentleman was quite a scoundrel. French nobility, but not the trustworthy sort." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Really? I always thought Lady Clara had a sensible head on her shoulders." Mrs. Merriweather leaned in. "Apparently she wasn't always so sensible." After dropping her letter, Miss Marple decided to pay an impromptu visit to young Timothy Payne. He lived with his widowed mother in a smartly kept brick cottage at the edge of town, filled with piles of newspapers, camera equipment, and the faint but constant scent of pipe smoke. Timothy opened the door, his hair as disheveled as ever. "Miss Marple, come in. Sorry about the mess," he said, tripping over a coil of photographic wire. "I was just developing some shots from the fete," she smiled kindly. "I won't stay long. I was only wondering if you still had the original negatives from the night of the portrait unveiling." He brightened. "Oh yes, absolutely. I've still got them in my darkroom. I always keep everything." Miss Marple followed him in. The small, darkened space was lit only by a red safe light, and the air was heavy with chemical fumes. She observed the setup with interest. "I took 3 exposures," he said, flipping through the contact sheets. 1 wide, 2 close-ups. "Here, see." Miss Marple took the sheet and squinted at it. Yes, that's exactly how I remember the portrait. No peculiar hand at the necklace then." "Nope," Timothy confirmed. "I even thought Lady Clara looked quite regal. Which, between you and me, isn't how she always comes across in real life." Miss Marple chuckled. "Quite." He held up another photo. "Now this is from the following morning. Someone asked me to take new pictures for the newspaper once the crowd cleared. That's when I noticed the change. And indeed, there it was, in the morning photo. The painted hand now touched the pearls with a disturbingly lifelike gesture. That brushstroke, Timothy said, leaning closer, wasn't there before, and it doesn't match the original painter's style. I can tell. I almost thought someone touched it up. Miss Marple tilted her head. Touched it up overnight? What an odd thing to do in a house full of guests. Timothy shrugged. Maybe the artist had second thoughts. Though he left straight after the unveiling, didn't he? He had Miss Marple remembered. Mr. Cedric Temple had bid an early goodbye. Citing a prior engagement in Norwich, she thanked Timothy and made her way to the Graceworth estate. It was still early enough in the afternoon for the drawing room to be bustling with soft-spoken activity. Lady Clara was nowhere to be seen, but Miss Marple was graciously admitted by the butler, who had clearly been instructed to be polite to the elderly guest from St. Mary Mead. Inside the drawing room, the painting loomed high above the mantel. This time, Miss Marple looked at it not just as an admirer, but with a detective's eyes. The hand now resting on the necklace was done in a style that subtly jarred with the rest. More textured, slightly heavier in pigment. Miss Marple turned slowly. The room was silent but for the faint ticking of the long case clock and the occasional chirrup of birds beyond the French doors. She walked toward the velvet curtain that had been pulled across the portrait on unveiling night. It hung to the side now, but something in its folds caught her attention. A faint glint, a suggestion of movement. She stepped closer and, without touching it, leaned in. There, tucked into the pleated fabric at waist height, was a tiny smear of dark blue oil paint, fresh enough to still gleam in the light. "Ah," Miss Marple whispered. "That is most interesting." She made no mention of it to the butler when he returned to escort her out. But as she left the estate, her mind buzzed. Someone had tampered with the portrait. Not in public view, but quietly, at night during a time when only a few people would have remained in the house. And someone had left behind evidence, a careless smear in the folds of the curtain. Back in her cottage that evening, Miss Marple made notes in her garden diary. Not of plants, but of people. Miss Marple's observations. Timothy's photo proves the portrait was altered after the unveiling. The painter had already departed. Or did he? The brushstroke does not match the original style. Blue oil paint on curtain, evidence of tampering. Who remained in the house overnight? Motive? Humiliation? Revenge? Or exposure? Outside, twilight softened the village rooftops, but inside Miss Marple's mind, the outlines of something sharper and more troubling began to form. She did not yet have all the pieces, but she had begun to sense the shape of the puzzle. Someone had used the portrait not to capture truth, but to reveal it in a cruel, calculated way. And cruelty, she had always said, was never far from vanity. Chapter 8. The Glove in the Whodunit was a morning tinged with autumn's early chill. When Constable Alec Reeves returned to the vicarage, his hat askew and his cheeks flushed from both wind and exertion. He'd walked down from the station at Miss Hartwood's behest after a note had been discovered, one that Miss Marple, quite discreetly, had managed to read over the housekeeper's shoulder. The note was unsigned, with no heading, but the handwriting was an unmistakable swirling cursive. "Look beneath the rose arbor. You'll find what was left behind." Most people would have dismissed it as a cruel prank or nonsense from a local mischief maker, but Miss Marple knew better. She recognized the tone, half cryptic, half goading, as something more than idle tomfoolery. And so it was that she'd taken her tea a little earlier than usual and had wandered into the back garden of the vicarage, ostensibly to admire the late-blooming asters. What she found under the rose arbor, nestled between the fallen petals and soft soil, was a single leather glove, small, tan, stained faintly near the cuff. Miss Marple picked it up with her handkerchief and turned it over delicately. It was not the gardening sort of fine, almost dainty glove, though not new. The cuff bore a monogram, J.H. "Quite a lady's glove," Miss Marple murmured to herself. folding it into her handkerchief and slipping it into her basket. Just as she heard the gravel crunch under Reeves's boots, she greeted the constable warmly, her expression unbothered. "Ah, Mr. Reeves, just the man. I fear Miss Hartwood is in a dreadful flutter this morning. Perhaps a quiet word from the law might help her spirits?" The young constable nodded, brushing the dew from his sleeve. "Aye, Miss Marple, I'll have a word. Funny business, all this." "Indeed," she replied mildly, then turned her steps. Not toward the vicarage, but toward her own cottage. Later that morning, the village of Chipping Down buzzed with a curious mix of dread and titillation. Rumors swirled faster than the fallen leaves. Word of the glove had somehow gotten out, no doubt, thanks to Dora Buckle, the cook at the vicarage, who had an unfortunately expressive face and an incurable need to share news at the village tea shop. Miss Pym was already discussing the glove with Mrs. Landreth. "Well, I'm not saying she's guilty," said Miss Pym, fanning herself. "But you do have to wonder why someone like Judith Hargrave would be sneaking about the vicarage garden in the middle of the night." Mrs. Landreth, who wore suspicion as comfortably as her shawls, nodded sagely. "There's always been something a little restless about Judith. Running off to Paris in her youth. All that art business. Very modern, very slippery." Neither woman had noticed Miss Marple at the next table, slowly stirring her tea. She allowed the gossip to swirl around her like smoke, all the while filing away each casual remark. Slippery and restless were not facts, but they reflected how the village had perceived Judith for years. And perception, as Miss Marple often said, could be more dangerous than truth. That afternoon, she visited the rectory again, ostensibly to drop off some quince jelly from Miss Hartwood. But her real destination lay upstairs. Judith Hargrave was seated on the small settee in the spare bedroom, staring at the covered portrait. She rose when Miss Marple entered, though she looked tired, her eyes shadowed, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her sleeve. "I didn't hear you come in." "I'm as quiet as the clock in the corner," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile, setting down her basket. "I thought you might like some jelly. Quince is good for the nerves, I find." Judith forced a small laugh. "You think I'm nervous?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She looked instead at the covered painting. "Has anyone moved the cloth?" "No," Judith said quickly, "and I won't, not yet." "I don't suppose you've lost a glove, dear?" Judith blinked. Glove. Yes, tan leather, monogrammed. Rather fine make, I should think. Found this morning under the rose arbor." For a moment, Judith's expression changed, no longer merely tired, but startled. Her lips parted, then pressed shut again. "I had a pair. I think I may have dropped one some days ago." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone deliberately neutral. "Gardens do have a way of swallowing things." There was a long silence. Judith looked down at her hands. "Are they saying I was there? That I—" "No one's saying anything useful yet," Miss Marple said softly. "Only the usual murmurs. You know how people talk when they haven't anything real to say." Judith stood suddenly, pacing to the window. "I didn't kill Nathaniel," she said in a low voice. "I know how it looks. I argued with him, everyone knows. But I didn't—" "I believe you," Miss Marple said calmly. "But sometimes belief isn't enough. We must show others what we see, however gently. That takes time and care." Judith turned back, her face taut. "There's something wrong with that painting," she whispered. "I don't mean the portrait itself, I mean what it became. It was like someone changed it deliberately. It wasn't what I painted, not entirely." Miss Marple's brows lifted a fraction. "Altered? Yes, after I left it to dry, the expression. The shadows. There was something new, something cruel in it. I thought I was imagining it, but now, I don't know." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Sometimes a small change speaks volumes." She turned then to the covered painting, hesitated, then looked back at Judith. "May I?" Judith didn't speak, but gave a small nod. Miss Marple lifted the cloth. revealing the portrait beneath. The man's face, Nathaniel, stared out with a strange, unfinished quality. A smear near the eyes, as if something had been wiped and rebrushed. A dullness in the background that didn't quite match the palette elsewhere. To an untrained eye, it might look like a stylistic choice. But to Miss Marple, it suggested something else. Tampering, subtle, purposeful. Miss Marple left the rectory with more questions than answers, but also with a sharpened sense of direction. The glove, the altered painting, the note beneath the arbor. These were not random fragments, they were deliberate. Steps in a carefully constructed deception. As she walked home beneath the golden canopy of trees. She passed by the general store, where young Freddie Harcourt was loitering, kicking a stone and muttering to himself. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said with a half-smile. She nodded politely, then paused. "Freddie, dear, where were you the night before last, I wonder?" Freddie looked up sharply. "Me? Home. Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said with her most innocent expression. "Only I do wonder how someone might have known about the glove under the arbor." Freddie opened his mouth, then shut it. Miss Marple walked on, smiling just faintly, as the wind picked up a scattering of leaves behind her. Chapter 9. A slippery memory and an unwelcome revelation. On the morning following the rather strained tea at Old Vicarage Lane, the village of Netherdean seemed unusually hushed. The sun rose behind a bank of lavender-gray clouds, casting a muted light over hedgerows and chimney tops. Even the birdsong had a curiously tentative air, as though nature itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, shawl neatly draped and gloves buttoned, stepped out for her usual walk to the high street, ostensibly to post a letter but also to observe. It was her custom, and as she often said, one saw so much more when not actively looking for anything in particular. The news of Mrs. Allison, Greystone's unexpected fainting spell, and her odd comment about the wrong eyes in the portrait had traveled swiftly. That was the way in villages. The original tale of the portrait had already rippled through gossip chains, but now, with the added seasoning of Greystone family drama, the village simmered with speculative enthusiasm. At the grocer's, Mrs. Simmons leaned in over the counter, while pretending to weigh a pound of apples. "Suppose you heard about the Greystone girl fainting dead away like that? Took 3 grown men to carry her up the stairs." Miss Marple merely nodded. "Oh dear, poor thing." Perhaps the strain of hosting guests, especially a painter, was a little too much. Mrs. Simmons, who never needed much prompting, leaned closer. "Oh, it weren't the artist. It was him." She nodded toward the door in a conspiratorial gesture. "Major Greystone. He came rushing down from London again. Big scene, I heard. Shouting match with Allison. Something about his father's honor. He stormed off to the King's Arms after." Miss Marple tilted her head, feigning concern. "That is rather dramatic for a family such as theirs. I do hope no unpleasant memories have been stirred." With a few polite pleasantries, Miss Marple departed and made her way to the King's Arms. She had no intention of entering. Of course not at her age and reputation. But she found it curious that Major Charles Greystone had returned so suddenly. As if on cue, the man himself emerged from the inn's doorway, rumpled and flushed. He nearly collided with her before stopping short. Miss Marple. He straightened his back, smoothing his lapels as if trying to reassemble his dignity. "You're everywhere in this village," she smiled kindly. "I find a stroll helps clear the mind. You look as if yours could use some fresh air, too." He gave a short, awkward chuckle. "Touché. I suppose you've heard the latest?" "Aye. Try not to assume anything until I know it. You look upset." He sighed, glancing over his shoulder before leaning slightly toward her. "It's that blasted portrait. There's something not right about it, and I don't mean just the artists. Flamboyance. It's changed somehow. My sister says I'm imagining things, but I know that's not how Father looked in the original."